Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Nicola Dempsey. I'm going to be the chair and one of the presenters, actually, for this session. We're going to be talking about placekeeping and why it's as important as placemaking. The concepts will become clearer as we get through the session. So I'm from the University of Sheffield. I work in the Department of Landscape Architecture. My research interests really do relate to long-term management and stewardship of places and green spaces in particular at all different scales. So I teach at planning scale, thinking about networks of spaces, and also right down to the smaller scale of pocket parks and small neighbourhood spaces that people use every day. Okay, so what do we mean, or what do I mean when we talk about placekeeping? This is a concept that was termed, probably about a decade ago, really, and it's not a particularly new idea, but it is a term which is a direct response to the focus that we have on placemaking. So that's where we're talking about the creation of high-quality places, those places that we love to go back to, the places that we love to take people to, that we feel safe in and enjoy. Places that are good for people, for well-being, that are welcoming and inclusive. When we talk about placekeeping, then, we're talking about what happens afterwards. So if we've created these high-quality places, what happens in terms of the management? How do we know, or is it an assumption that's a well-placed assumption, that places will be looked after and managed for the long term? Because increasingly, as we do research into this, and certainly as austerity has bitten more than once, we know that actually isn't a fair assumption to make. Mostly because there's a lot in our landscapes, our urban landscapes, that need looking after, that they can't look after themselves, that they need to be maintained. And that is regardless of how much has been spent at the capital investment stage. And even though that placemaking part of a project can be very exciting, and it's certainly easier to find funding for, it's all about how we maintain that and how we retain that over the long term. Because places do change, users change, residents living around a playground will grow up, those children will move away, populations and demographics change, but so does the use of the space here, parks, but also kind of green infrastructure more widely across the city. And it's for that reason that it may not be as I say, as exciting as the design stage, but I think it's fundamental to be talking about maintenance, to be talking about enhancing the quality, retaining and enhancing the quality and benefits of well-designed places through long-term responsive management. So managing through a well-designed place and a well-planned place. And that's kind of the combination of skills that we try to develop in our students at the Department of Landscape Architecture up in Sheffield. So I think we could all think about places where the maintenance has fallen down, where the money may have run out, where that have been adversely affected when we've had funding cuts. Placekeeping is important from the outset to make sure that our investment is safeguarded. This idea of decline that places can fall into a spiral of decline if places do not have that continued investment and that continued maintenance, which leads to places feeling neglected. It may not be that they actually are neglected, but once they start to feel neglected and feel unsafe and feel uncared for, that really can lead a place to kind of slip down a slippery slope, which begets worse and worse behaviour within it, and less kind of attention and care. And it's not about attributing blame or saying that places are failing necessarily, but it's about trying to understand the underlying reasons for this kind of decline that happens. So I think, and our team at the University of Sheffield talk about this a lot, the need to have as much emphasis on that long-term stewardship, management and placekeeping of green spaces. I think my next slide may be a bit, oh no, it's formatting nicely. I can see something different on here. The placemaking, as I said, easier to deal with than placekeeping. As I say, where places are changing, much more difficult to try and secure funding. And later on in the session, my colleagues will be talking more about how that happens in practice. So by raising the profile of placekeeping and the idea that places may kind of develop over time, declining and improving over a period of time, which when you think about the way that a tree may grow, a landscape may change over time, short-term political or short-term design timescales, they are often at odds with a very long-term approach and a long time scale that we need to think about when we talk about our landscapes, urban landscapes too. These are just some pictures where places where the management of places has become neglected, it's become difficult. This is a park just near the University of Sheffield, and yes, I am going to show another picture of trees. Well, I show a picture of trees being cut down, but this is a well-managed kind of approach to actually, if we go back, to sort of show how to help make that place feel safer and to kind of improve those sightlines of a space that has over 20, 30, 40 years become very neglected. And we can see there are things going on down at the bottom of that site, but with topography, with poorly managed vegetation, we get into this kind of idea of a spiral of decline. So when we try to, as academics, obviously, try to think about how we can talk about a concept like placekeeping into sort of more manageable concepts, let's say, or sub-concepts, we have found that through a number of different projects, the first one was an EU-funded project, actually, that was kind of finished about 7 or 8 years ago now. We need to think about placekeeping and our long-term stewardship as a set of combined, here we have petals, but if we think about these different sort of strands of placekeeping, partnership, funding, design and management thought of together and considered together and enacted together, governance, so who's doing the decision making, who are those people involved, an underlying policy, as we may or may not know, green space, and certainly public green space, the provision of that is not a statutory requirement, and it's discretionary. So when austerity bites, the green spaces will, they're often hit hardest and hit first. And then also evaluation as well. It's very difficult to sort of get a sense of who's using our green spaces. There aren't necessarily turnstiles that people will go through when they're entering green spaces and parks. So about how can we evaluate that going forward? And thinking about those as a combination. So not taking any one of those in isolation, but trying to understand how they sort of respond to that kind of more, that holistic concept to function well. So even though I've just said it's all about functioning together, it is useful to sort of dissect these in a little bit more detail. So who is involved in placekeeping? So we have the public sector, private sector, community voluntary sector, any kind of combination of those, depending on the types of spaces, the scale at which we're talking about. So again, a small pocket park will have a different set of partners or stakeholders, let's say, than a city developing its green and open spaces strategy. But we kind of tried to boil it down into thinking about who owns the space, which is often a local authority, but increasingly maybe private developers or community voluntary sector, but who manages, who pays, but ultimately who cares. And sometimes those are quite different groups and sets of people. And again, thinking about how they interact, what their motivations are, and also when and how they get involved. So here are just some diagrams. As a colleague of mine was working out how placekeeping actually happens in terms of the involvement of people, and it may be that if there's steady investment from the beginning, or a project has had some money from the beginning, then that might have an initial hit, and then it steadies off as perhaps a community group gets involved, a friends of or a part user group. But it may then be that actually if the funding starts to run out and it's difficult to kind of find that funding for maintenance, that then drops down where we have placekeeping that is happening on a sort of more of a cyclical basis. Perhaps it's placekeeping that's event-driven, fundraising, big events that are happening, which will be more like the fourth column down, fourth row down, event-driven more, or it could be even more sporadic than that. So unplanned, uneven placekeeping. That could be groups going in and doing a litter pick. So we are talking about different types of activities at different scales, depending on who's involved. What have we got here? So it raises questions of, if there are different partners involved, what are those motivations that they have? And are they equal partners in the decision-making process? How democratic is that decision-making? Obviously, we've been having sessions today around Brexit, very much an important part of what, kind of everything at the moment, but certainly that kind of trying to understand how democratic some of these processes are, particularly if different sets of partners and stakeholders are being asked to take on the role of managing green spaces in light of there being less funding available to local authorities, for example. Is the community engaged? How is that community engaged? What is that consultation process like? And what happens post-consultation? That's something that's becoming more and more interesting to us. And is it actually business as usual that continues with a bit of consultation thrown in? So again, if we think about that governance and those different groups and how they may respond to management, then that might help make those processes more transparent and more joined up. Something as well that is prevalent in the work that we do in Sheffield is a lot of work around how community groups are getting involved and how much they want to get involved in the management of places. The big society, our long-standing attachment to green spaces, to gardens, to kind of mucking in, all of these things have a legacy, and part of that legacy is now a sort of an over-reliance on volunteers, one might say. So what capacity do volunteers actually have? Is it fair to expect them to be looking after parks and green spaces, getting involved in some of the more hands-on management of sites? Austerity means, yes, we've seen much more widespread use of the familiar funding mechanisms. So again, we're not seeing, Peter will talk a little bit more about this, but we're talking about income generation starting to play more of a part. I talk about what's happening in Sheffield a bit more, but I know obviously in London, high-profile parks have been holding large-scale events and concerts for a long time. That brings with it challenges in terms of who has access to the space. And then these ideas of asset transfer, or the less popular and well-used phrase, asset disposal, becoming more popular or happening, not necessarily meaning that the ownership of that land comes away from the local authority, but it may come with or without an endowment, but with the public sector overseeing the process of management, but at a more hands-off kind of in terms of the involvement that they may have, that involvement is becoming less direct. Again, some of these challenges that are all responses to austerity and other drivers. So finally, the work that we continue to do raises questions around accountability, democracy. My final question, volunteers, we talk about the capacity. Volunteers aren't around forever, and what about succession? Because yes, like trees, people do die. For us, and some of the things that I think will be coming up in the discussion, is some of these different funding mechanisms and models around trying to look after spaces. So Newcastle is about to go live with a new Parks and Allotments Trust, which I think Peter will be able to talk more about. We have the Heritage Fund and the National Trust having their Future Parks Accelerator Fund with over £10 million available for local authorities to manage their spaces more efficiently. And then, Sheffield has been linking up with its public health, parks and public health spending have been kind of combined here. So we have more of that as a discourse, but I would ask, does that actually mean that we've got any more, anything different is happening than business as usual?